Faces look out at us from the shadows of time. What did these eyes see when they first looked on America? Wide open prairies, horse-drawn wagons, light-skinned people who ate with forks and wore high-buttoned shoes. It was a strange and wondrous land. The eyes that looked back at them were curious, sometimes inviting, often distrustful. Give us your labor, they seemed to say, but don't ask to be one of us. But these newest Americans were not to be denied. This was the land of dreams and possibilities. They would find a way to succeed. Along with the anger and distrust, there would be joy and success. They would play their part in the defining of America. They were home from the Eastern Sea. The Chinese were the first to arrive, mostly from Canton, young, able-bodied men ready to work, mostly unable to read or write.
There are very few stories available from the Chinese American perspective. There are no diaries, there are no letters, there are no songs, there are no jokes, anything that has survived what was obviously an epic experience.
Among the few remaining artifacts is the English-Chinese phrasebook, which quietly opens a secret door. The first pages, filled with phrases of everyday life, must have made it seem easy. An enterprising man could make his fortune and return to his village like a prince. Both practical and philosophical, it was the first introduction many would have to life in America. But as the pages of the book unfold, another story emerges. There would be a dark side to the American experience.
The first thing that you realize about this book is that there are at least 250 ways to die. Every line says he was suffocated in his sleep, he was stabbed to death, he was thrown in jail, and it goes on and on and on and on.
China was plagued by floods, famine, and poverty. Young men who could get passage money came to the Gold Mountain, America. Wives and children were not potential wage earners and had to be left behind out of economic necessity. Besides, no self-respecting young woman would go alone to the bawdy American frontier. Cut off from normal family life, the young Chinese men in America became known as the Bachelor Society, even though most of them were sending money back to their wives and children in China. Chinatown is thought of as a fun place to eat, but back then it was the only place the Chinese were allowed to live. Here they eased the hard times by gambling, drinking, telling stories, forming business associations, social clubs, and even a Chinese opera. It was the birth of Chinese America. George Yi is a living link between yesterday and today. His father was born in San Francisco, but George was born in China. Like the Bachelor Society, George and his mother had to be left back home. He did not join his father until he was a young man. Ask George the secret of his success as a Chinatown merchant. He will tell you, hard work. But his business and social connections seem even more important. George is a member of the Yi Family Association. The Yis immigrated from the same village in China. When their forefathers came to America, they formed the family association to recreate the ties of village life. They were a means of survival and a cultural home, brokering jobs, settling labor disputes, translating and writing letters, planning parties and festivals, housing new arrivals, setting up pensions, and sending money back home. George Yee has had a successful life in Seattle's International District, but it came at great cost. Like the men of the Bachelor Society, George had to leave his family back in China. He did not see his son Fred for 18 years.
I came to Seattle basically to join my father. You know, my family has been here for 3 or 4 generations, but I was raised in Hong Kong, and I really haven't met my father until I was in Seattle when I was 17, 18 years old.
Fred and his father were fortunate. They got along well in spite of the long estrangement, but their experience in America was dramatically different.
It was late 60s and early 70s. It was, I guess, at the height of the Vietnam era. I was almost drafted. I got a deferment, you know, because of going to college. I remember seeing a lot of protests about the war, and a lot of young people getting out on the streets and voice out their concerns about a lot of the social issues.
Fred Yee met 20-year-old Amy Wong soon after they had both immigrated from Hong Kong. As volunteers at a community service center in Seattle's Chinatown, they were determined to merge the Chinese traditions of respect for the elders and family closeness with the activism they were seeing in America.
I became to realize that even in the Chinese community in Seattle, even though we had a long history, I could say that there was, other than the family associations, we didn't even have an organization that would address, you know, the social needs of our elderlies.
第一行一，第一行一，第四行53，第一行12。
In 1987, Fred had the opportunity to be involved in something that had never been done before. He and Amy helped found the first nursing home for Chinese elderly in the Pacific Northwest, the Kinon. Today, Fred is its director.
The older folks came to the States to work and to make for a better life for themselves and for their families. And without hard work, they could not have achieved that. I think if we can treasure the notion of hard work, and you will be rewarded by working hard and by doing whatever you do the best. And I think that is something that for our generation should pass along to our children and our grandchildren. In our generation, I think we are a lot more fortunate. Discrimination is less overt, even though they are still in existence. We have a lot more opportunities. We are, in general, better educated.
Amy also works with the elderly in Seattle. As a social worker, she helps people to remain independent and to live at home for as long as possible. Amy's parents are now retired and care for their grandchildren while Fred and Amy are at work. In Hong Kong, her parents owned successful restaurants. When circumstances forced them to sell their businesses and come to America, Amy's mother found work as a seamstress in a garment factory. Her father became a cook. For the Wongs, immigration meant a step down.
Baby 有冇嚟啊？今日係啊，食飯嗰日啦。This land is mine from California to the Ninga Island. When the river flows to Christmas water, this land is made from you and me.
又唱過嗰次啦。
Amy's parents did what many others have done and continue to do today, work that requires little English. The same work that was open to the original Chinese pioneers 100 years ago. In the 1860s, many came to Washington for gold, but the Chinese were soon restricted from staking claims. So they found work in laundries, canneries, lumber mills, as cooks and day laborers. In other parts of America, an unexpectedly long and bloody civil war was being fought. But the western frontier was sparsely populated in the 1860s, providing an opportunity for the Chinese, who were recruited from China to build the modern miracle of technology, the railroads.
As legend has it, which I'm not sure is true or not, Charles Crocker's Chinese servant, somebody, they always had a name that started with Sing, How, or whatever. Anyway, the legend has it that his servant says, "Why don't you try Chinese?" The supervisor of the railroad gangs at that time, Strobridge, was dead set against using Chinese. They were small, slight. He thought that they just couldn't handle they wouldn't be durable. Charles Crocker was desperate, so he tried 50 workers, and they worked out so well that he immediately hired more until they reached, I think, a high of about 15,000 Chinese workers.
When Charles Crocker completed the main line of the Central Pacific in California, railroad fever moved into Washington. "17,000 Chinese blasted tunnels through the North Cascade Mountains. The Iron Horse advanced through the coastal forests and sagebrush deserts. The railroad would be the essential foundation for Washington's economy." The icy winters, the dynamite and rock slides had taken their toll. Chinese graves lined the tracks. The English-Chinese phrase book proved all too true. By the 1870s, the railroad was completed. Chinese were out of work, and so were many others in the Depression of the 1870s. Fear of competition from Chinese workers resulted in the first legislation to prohibit immigration to the United States based solely on race, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. No such law has ever been passed against immigrants of European or any other non-Asian descent.
It's essentially sent a signal to every little podunk town and city and state on the West Coast that it was time to get rid of the Chinese, or as the saying went at that time, the Chinese must go. Tacoma chased all the Chinese out of their town in one day, essentially marched them all down to a train station south of Tacoma and sent them packing. And then in February 1886, Seattle tried to follow suit. The Chinese were rounded up by a mob and marched down Main Street down to the docks, and essentially the mob was going to load the Chinese on boats and send them to San Francisco. Seattle was one of the few cities that stepped in and protected the Chinese.
Not only did the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibit immigration, It prohibited naturalization. Denial of citizenship would have a devastating impact not only on the Chinese, but for all the Asian groups that followed. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first of 14 anti-Chinese laws aimed at preventing them from successfully settling in this country. It was not until 1943 that Chinese were granted the right to become U.S. citizens. Then the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed, and 100 Chinese would be allowed to immigrate each year. In 1965, more open immigration laws paved the way for people to come from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the People's Republic of China.
Some of the traditional values that our parents have may be at times in conflict with what our values are. There are many traditional values that may seem impractical to a lot of younger people, but I think sometimes if we step back and look at why those values can continue to exist, then maybe we can find they do have their useful purpose. The traditional value of respecting your elders, I think, is a value that is timeless.
At the turn of the century, the West was expanding. Frontier towns sprang up across Washington state. In 1903, in the small eastern Washington town of Okanagan, a dapper young stranger stepped off the stagecoach. No one knew where he came from. They had never seen a Japanese. They watched open-mouthed as he set up his tripod and snapped the first pictures most folks had ever seen. His name was Frank Matsura. For the next 10 years, he immortalized a world that must have seemed strange and wondrous, so unlike his native Japan. By the time he died in 1913, his photographs were legendary, and Frank had so many friends. The entire town turned out for his funeral. The Chinese Exclusion Act had robbed America of a much-needed labor force. Entrepreneurs turned once again to Asia to begin the cycle all over again with the Japanese. They were first recruited for the sugar plantations in Hawaii in the 1880s. When their contracts expired, many came to the West Coast following the promise of America. Work hard and be your own boss. Some were able to do this in small businesses and farms. Others were forced into jobs no one else would take, in industries the Chinese had been excluded from. Many Japanese farmers settled in Puget Sound, lacing the landscape of Fife, Tacoma, Renton, and Bellevue with small truck farms. Others moved inland, where they could grow vast fields of hay and potatoes in the desert valley of the Yakima Indians.
The Japanese immigrants to Washington those who moved off into the Yakima Valley did a really marvelous thing. Among them were poets, and there was no reason for them to stop writing poetry. Never mind what some people would say about, oh, they were too busy trying to make money to write poetry. The poems were short, only 3 lines. A really good example, I believe, for our purposes goes something like this. And early to rise, no matter how early though, it don't make me rich. Obviously, the first line is in English, and early to rise, because it comes from Ben Franklin. And then the rest of it would be in their Japanese, adapted for that purpose, right there in Yakima.
Baseball was a national sport, and they had 2 leagues in Yakima Valley. The one I played on was the Wapato Nippons, which was comprised of Nisei boys in that Yakima Valley. We had a pretty fair team, and it was the only sport that we had something to look forward to, so we played every Sunday in a league.
The Sunday ball games were the center of social life for Japanese communities across the state. From Wapato to Walla Walla, the town teams came together in an event that reached far into their hearts and dreams. Through the games, they were able to belong to each other and to this new land, for what could be more American than baseball?
When his ball team came to Walla Walla to play our town team, and that's the first time I met him, but of course, I was so young, and he was already grown. I don't think he was paying too much attention to me at that time.
At the turn of the century, Harry Honda's father was one of many Japanese farmers drawn to the harsh sagebrush country of central Washington.
We had to really work hard to get this ground into shape. There were boulders in here, tons and tons of boulders that we removed from here to be able to farm. But it was rich, and it produced a real good crop, so we were thankful for that.
The Honda farm was on the Yakima Indian Reservation, the only land open to the Japanese because of a second cousin to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Alien Land Law. This state law prohibited aliens from owning land. An alien was anyone who did not register his intention to become a citizen. This was a catch-22 for Asians who were ineligible for citizenship. Japanese farmers were able to get around this for a while by leasing from the Yakima Indians, whose reservation was on federal land outside the control of the state alien land law.
The Japanese felt that this kind of anti-Japanese sentiment was whipped up by the fact that the Japanese just farmed better. They were able to, with their green thumbs, make the desert bloom, although they were quite realistic about how much effort went into that and how tenuous their hold was on it.
Tenuous it was. Each time Japanese farmers gained a foothold, another loophole would be closed in the law. Tighter restrictions soon forced them off the 400-acre hayfields on the Indian reservation to smaller plots leased from willing whites.
The Japanese were able to make a good profit out of it. They created new kinds of crops like melon growing. They went into squash growing and so forth.
By the 1940s, Japanese Americans had demonstrated their talent for survival and had become an integral part of communities throughout Washington state. They had worked very hard to build farms, businesses, schools, churches, and had settled into a welcome time of stability and peace.
I was taking a bath in my wife's home, folks' home, and reminiscing, saying, gosh, Texas A&M, they didn't have such a hot offense. They barely beat Washington State 7-6. Suddenly, my wife called from downstairs saying, the Upton Close is on TV, radio. And he said, they're bombing Pearl Harbor. I said, who's bombing Pearl Harbor? He said, Japan. I said, cut it out, no. I said, I'm going to take a long bath, and there's nothing you can say is going to get me out of this bathtub. But she came up and said, I'm serious. So I went and listened to the radio with her. The whole world came to an end December 7th, 1941.
Japanese Americans throughout the West Coast quickly felt the response. Norio Wakamatsu was living in Seattle when the war broke out.
I thought maybe there would be mobs around, but instead there was sort of a cold fury. No one said much.
The feeling was pretty hard, and those that we thought were friends were not our friends really, but some of that stuck with us. They had a hard time with the people of this community.
And in the eyes of maybe the general public, somehow they were not able to distinguish them from the enemy. And I think that is the bottom line there, is a racist presumption of guilt, somehow by association with a genetic kind of hereditary association with the enemy. They certainly could make a distinction between a German American and a Nazi.
The projection of the enemy onto the face of Japanese Americans soon found its ultimate expression. Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, declaring that all those of Japanese ancestry, including the Issei, the first generation, and the Nisei, those born in America, must be evacuated to concentration camps. 112,000 Japanese Americans were removed on the West Coast, some 10,000 in Washington State. They were sent first to temporary holding centers in Portland and the Puyallup Fairgrounds. Later, they were shipped by rail to Hart Mountain in Wyoming and Minidoka in Idaho.
I always thought that I was an American. Except when someone called me a Jap, I could only see Caucasian people. And unless I looked in the mirror, I thought that I looked just like them. But when the evacuation order came, I could not believe that I could understand my folks. They were aliens to go into a camp, concentration camp. But I was an American citizen, and I just couldn't. In fact, it just felt like the whole bottom fell out.
The mighty Columbia River flows through the heartland of Washington State, arterial for commerce, recreation, a scenic wonder. In 1942, the Columbia went from being a treasure of natural beauty to becoming a boundary line that determined which Japanese would be taken from their homes and which would not.
All the people west of the Columbia River had to evacuate, and but those east of the Columbia River did not have to. For instance, Kennewick is only 2 miles from Pasco. Those in Kennewick had to go, but those in Pasco did not. So Harry, who lived in Yakima Valley, he had to go.
Ada did not have to go. She was working as a waitress in Pasco on the east bank of the Columbia River.
Even there, I was restricted. I couldn't go within a few miles. I don't exactly remember the mile, but I think 2 miles from, say, the railroads or the telephone company, anything that they thought was vital to the war, we were restricted.
Finally, the day came. I can remember we were put on buses from a certain place. I think it was the Armory that we were loading on the buses. And I remember driving by Jefferson Park, where I played golf every Sunday. And then we ended up in the Puyallup Fairgrounds. One of the funny stories that came out was that some of the couples got married. And can you imagine at nighttime with 7 families listening to every pin drop?
midsummer day marks our third move, this time to Minidoka. I stand silent at my small window. White dawn moonlight, on the road a frozen rim of snow, muffled footsteps echo sadness. 3 children sacrificed to this alien land. Now the aged father hauls coal through falling snow. Deeply moved by wretched scenes of camp life, my heart mourns.
We were sent to Minidoka, and I can still remember on the train going over there, we were told to pull our blinds down at one location, and naturally when they say pull your blinds down, everybody's curious, so we peeked and we could see in the distance a large number of buildings with lights. And later on we found out that was Hanford. My wife's uncle, he had lived in Tacoma when she was young, and he went back to Japan and got married, and he had 5 children, and they lived in Nagasaki. And on the day that the atom bomb was dropped in Nagasaki, he was at work. He survived, but his whole family, his wife and 5 children were killed. He practically went insane. That's the way he told my wife.
One of the greatest agonies of wartime relocation was a deep division within the Japanese community. Many young men joined the 442nd All-Nisei Combat Unit, the most decorated of its size in military history. Others joined Army intelligence. Many contributed wholeheartedly to the war effort to demonstrate their loyalty as Americans. Others believed that Executive Order 9066 was both illegal and unconstitutional. The protests took many forms. Some demonstrated in the camps, some refused to go into the service until they were released from camp and their constitutional rights restored. Many of them went to federal prison for their actions. Others turned to the battlefield of the U.S. court system to challenge these restrictions. Gordon Hirabayashi, then a senior at the University of Washington, refused to obey curfew or go to a concentration camp.
It's the principle of the thing that I couldn't accept. And so I then sat down and wrote a statement for the FBI that I anticipated meeting when the time came, saying I could not accept that as an American citizen. I wasn't just protesting, I was making, in my view, a positive position of upholding the Constitution.
He challenged the federal government on the grounds that Executive Order 9066 was unconstitutional. He went to the lower court, where the judge instructed the jury that their only task was to rule on whether or not Gordon Hirabayashi was of Japanese ancestry. Proof of racial heritage was proof of his guilt in defying the executive order.
We were looking forward to a hearing, eventually, within a 2-year period, by the Supreme Court. And I felt the Supreme Court is made up by 9 wise, unbiased persons, and whose main raison d'etre for existence is the upholding of the Constitution. So I felt when we get to the Supreme Court, we'll have our day.
He was wrong. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court's verdict of guilt. It would be almost 50 years before Gordon Hirabayashi was vindicated. In 1987, the lower court found that the government misrepresented the facts to the Supreme Court and ordered his conviction reversed. In 1988, the U.S. Congress took steps to provide redress. Each person of Japanese ancestry interned during World War II would receive a formal apology and $20,000 in compensation. The Seattle Japanese American community led the nation in the fight for redress. But Congress has yet to appropriate the money. Some believe it never will.
In many respects, the internment of Japanese Americans is a culmination of that century of anti-Asian sentiment that continues to view the Asian immigrant as somehow not being capable of becoming a true American, whatever that means.
Harry Honda was never able to return to the family farm in the Yakima Valley, where he had worked so hard to make the desert bloom. After he was released from the concentration camp at Heart Mountain, he joined his brother in Spokane. Jobs were hard to come by for Japanese Americans, but Harry was fortunate. He was hired by the Northern Pacific, now the Burlington Northern, one of the few companies that did not dismiss Japanese American workers during World War II. Harry and Ada married. They raised 3 daughters. The Wapato Nippon baseball team is history. But Harry Honda has found a new life among other Japanese Americans who came to Spokane after the war. They have built a close-knit Japanese American community centered around church, family, and old friends.
That says, hallelujah, Jesus is our King. That's nice. He came home with his eggs too.
Well, the hardships I'm sure that my father went through, and even for my mother, although she did not go to relocation centers, I'm sure she felt the stigma, prejudice, regardless of whether she went to camp or not. But those hardships and those experiences have made my parents what they are, very strong.
The Filipino American community of the Yakima Valley is one of the oldest in Washington state. Its founding members came from the Philippines in 1918. They were young men, dashing and adventurous.
I noticed when we were growing up, one of the things we talked about when we got older is we referred to white people as Americans. He said, oh, you eat that American food, you eat that, and it never occurred to us that we were Americans until, we started growing up and stuff. We just called white people Americans. We grew up probably more American than Leave It to Beaver. I mean, we were American, We just happened to eat rice all the time. It was a little confusing.
Unlike the Chinese and Japanese, these immigrants came from another part of the United States. Our first colony, the Philippines. I had picked hops with some Indians under the towering shadows of Mount Rainier. I had pruned apples with the dispossessed Americans in the rich deltas of the Columbia River. I had cut and packed asparagus in California. I had weeded peas with Japanese in Arizona. My departure from the Philippines was actually the breaking of my ground, the tearing up of my roots. As I stayed longer and searched farther, This feeling of not belonging became more acute until it distorted my early vision of America. I did not know what part of America was mine, and my awareness of not belonging made me desperate and terribly lonely. In 1889, Washington joined the Union. America was now united coast to coast by the railroads. The United States was a growing economic and military force in the world. In 1898, the U.S. became embroiled in the Spanish-American War. On the Pacific front, the battle against Spain was fought on a chain of islands which had been a Spanish colony for 350 years, the Philippines. The U.S. needed the Philippine Islands to expand its military presence in the Pacific. The U.S. won the Spanish-American War, driving the Spanish out. The elated Filipinos thought they had been given freedom. They formed a republic and applied for recognition as an independent nation. The U.S. refused to recognize Philippine independence and invaded the country. It would take the U.S. 2.5 years to destroy the Filipinos' movement for independence. By the time the fighting had ended, 200,000 Filipinos were dead. The U.S. moved in and set up its 2 largest overseas military bases, replaced Spanish schools with American schools, taught English and American history, opened dance halls and movie theaters. For the first time, Filipinos witnessed images of the good life in America.
After the Spanish-American War, the Philippines became part of the United States, and so all Filipinos became nationals of the U.S., American nationals, and all they needed to come to this country was their passageway. They could just pay for their boat fare and they can come. And it wasn't just restricted to men. Women could come. The things that would restrict women from coming in those days was 350 years of Spanish rule, which said that a woman didn't go alone without a chaperone. So if there weren't Filipino women here, then our Filipino men married women of other races.
The first anti-Filipino incident in the state was in 1927 in the Yakima Valley. The white perpetrators said it was competition for jobs. The judge disagreed. He said the real reason was competition for white women.
We had a lot of pictures of these guys in their tuxedos, or men in their reefer coats and their gloves and their hats, snapped down, looking so sharp. And my mom would say, "Look at them. They don't have any money in their pocket, but they look like $1 million." And that's true. They did. They looked wonderful.
1927 was also the year that 18-year-old Harry Buxit arrived in Wapato to go to school, but he quickly became involved in the unfolding drama. A mob gathered in town and delivered an ultimatum to the Filipinos: get out of town by 6 p.m. or else. Harry Buxit joined other Filipinos in the home of a white sympathizer. They waited with loaded guns. At 6, 3 white men appeared on the road. "Hold your fire. We're officers of the law. We broke up the mob." The battle was over, but it was only the beginning of the war. More racial incidents followed. In the next 10 years, some 30 communities throughout the United States experienced violent racial confrontations, beatings, stabbings, arson, riots, and murder. West of the Cascade Mountains, Seattle Filipinos were leading the fight to unionize the cannery and agricultural laborers. Once again, the Filipinos were harassed, but they did not give up. In time, the Cannery and Agricultural Workers Union, run by Filipinos, became a powerful voice for laborers.
Now, in Washington State, when the Alien Land Laws appeared not to include Filipinos, or rather to exclude Filipinos. The legislature, legislature in 1937 moved to correct this error that they saw, because clearly their intent was to exclude all Asian groups, even if they were American, which was the case with the Filipinos.
Harry Buxet and 12 other Filipino farmers challenged the alien land law by attempting to buy land. They were arrested and sent to jail. The roundup of Harry Buxet and the other Filipino American farmers had a paradoxical impact on the community. Instead of discouraging them, it united them to raise bail money and legal fees.
It eventually became a community. They built the hall, and now it's the 37th anniversary. And that's where it came from, was when they arrested the 13. It was a reaction to that.
This is sweet rice too. Sweet rice flour. Okay, I've never had that before, so I'll try one of those.
Do you have some more?
Over the years, this organization expanded to become the social center of the community.
As far as I can tell, it's the first Filipino American hall in the Pacific Northwest. And it's kind of neat. They built it out of concrete. You know, that sucker's going to be there forever.
When the Filipinos had a real tiny clubhouse, remember that? And they held these dances, and I had kind of went just to see what it was like. And I saw them, and I thought, there's something I'd like to have. We're kind of what they call May December marriage. We're two different religions. We're two different backgrounds, farm and city. We're two different cultures, but we work wonderfully well together.
One of the things I hear reoccurring in the community all the time with the guys I grew up with is that, you know, they would go and work at Hanford and they'd make a bunch of money, and then they'd say, you know, but I miss my homeboys. You know, this is home. This is where I belong. When you really get hurt in Seattle or something and you need someone to talk to, you come home and you talk. You eat a little pig. Maybe you don't even talk to anybody. You just come home and you know what's always there for you.
Harry Buxet and his close friend Roy Baldos led the fight to repeal the alien land law. Harry was the first Filipino to own land in the Yakima Valley. He died in 1971. Today, his widow Esperanza, his daughter Lorena, and her family still live on the Buxet farm. Harry Buxet's daughter Lorena grew up in a world that combined Filipino traditions with small-town Americana. They had dances, cakewalks, and sweetheart contests to raise money for scholarships and maintain the community hall. Lorena left home to go to school in the 60s, married Tom Silva, and then returned to Wapato.
The reason why we came back to Wapato was in 1971, my father passed away.
Her husband Tom was born in the Philippines and had never lived on a farm before.
He thoroughly loves it. He goes out there and talks to his trees. And this is why we came back, is because he said it's better to raise a family here in a smaller community.
Coming home again brought new problems for the Silvas. Jobs were scarce, and they could not make a living on the family farm.
Tom and I both work. Tom says he works to support the farm.
Trained as a chemical engineer, Tom now works as a pollution control expert for the county.
Thank you. Bye. We have 3 adults. Everybody has some kind of, they have a feeling of discrimination. I myself discriminate against certain things too, or sometimes people, we're only human, I think. And there is discrimination. I can feel it, in my place of work, not only my office that I'm at now, but, people will walk in and I'm the only brown person or, different colored person. And they'll look at you and I'll say, may I help you or can I help you? And, well, I'll wait for so-and-so. When I feel that they're that way, I'll make it difficult for them too, because I wanted to see how they react. And it's just probably just my devilish feeling that comes out, so I provoke, I just want to see what their reactions are. And, I can feel it.
I think people have taken for granted what it was a hard fight to get. And our kids don't even understand it. The new immigrants who've come in don't understand this. They think whatever they have now, access to good jobs, the ability to live in all the neighborhoods, wasn't always there.
The years following World War II marked the beginning of a global shift from Europe to the Pacific Rim. U.S. involvement in Asian countries intensified. Continuing the cycle that began in the Philippines, the U.S. became involved in a series of wars in Asia, beginning with the Korean War in 1950. By the 1960s, unfamiliar names like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam became a familiar part of our vocabulary.
When these people lost their war, they had to flee their own native land. I mean, they had never been outside of this land. We followed these people then through the camps in Thailand, the refugee camps there, and then to Oakland, and to what to them is a very, very strange and foreign country. And they themselves are seen then by other Americans as being foreign, very, very foreign to this land.
Now this for the necklace? Okay.
They cannot understand meat wrapped up in plastic. I mean, they cannot even understand how this is part of the larger animal because they've never seen the thing ready-made in this way. And, that's how different this way of life is to them. And yet, you have to think that it is intimately connected with America. That's why they are here.
And less than a high school degree, 8,300.
Every group of Americans, and therefore every individual, brings a distinctive heritage into the total picture that we call America. This is the vision we need to regain, I think, of being part of America by virtue of us having our own history here, which does not separate us from everybody else, but is our contribution to what America is. Now, that's part of it. That is to say that the rest of America has to recognize this also.
Statistics here indicate that with a college education,
I'm delighted to see so many people here today.
Asian Pacific Americans continue to arrive in Washington state. They come from India, Bangladesh, Burma, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Fiji, the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Laos, Malaysia, the Marshall Islands, the Northern Marianas, Pakistan, Palau, Western Samoa, Tahiti, Thailand, Tonga, and Vietnam. These new citizens will learn the stories of the earliest Asian pioneers. Their monuments are all around us. What did these eyes see when they first looked on America? They saw a world unlike any they had seen before, strange and wondrous, brutal and tender. They saw themselves becoming a part of this nation they would help to shape and enrich, an America that is still in the process of realizing the potential of its ideals. A vision of a society that knows no exclusion, that celebrates the rich history and diversity of all its people.